Oh, Canada. I'm so disappointed. Now, I'm afraid that I'm going to have to concede that environmental damages occur in the developing world. That's kind of a given. But we've already told you that that degree of environmental damage is not as great as they're trying to describe. I've told you very clearly in my Prime Minister's speech that South America and Africa combined only contributes to about 10% of global emissions, whereas 10 top countries, developed countries in the world, contribute to more than 50%. But even if this kind of environmental damages occur, they never proved that having measures such as green technologies institutionalized was a practical solution. They never proved how it can deal with the very same problems that they brought to the table today. And in fact, every single example that they brought to the table effectively negates their case about Egypt or Russia. These are all examples of countries that had to suffer the consequences of environmental regulation because they simply could not afford the environmental mechanisms to defend themselves from such techniques. Their case simply refused to deal with practicality, and we've consistently told you from side proposition that they needed to do so. And what happens when these kind of attitudes continue is that people pay for it with their lives, which was also something we consistently told you. I'm going to deal with two very simple things in my government reply. Number one, practice, and number two, principle. Let's move on to the practice. Now, we've told you that nations need to develop, we need to give them time, before they can pay for green technologies and all of the measures that opposition told us in this side of the house. But the thing is, they never told us how nations will be able to afford. And then they said, they walked up here with the example of Copenhagen, which was the only thing that they told us about affordability, and said, developed nations offered it, but developing nations didn't take it. That's a lie, ladies and gentlemen. Not a single dollar was collected, and the deadline has passed. There is no money available to develop renewable technologies, and nothing is being done because their solution and their model simply doesn't have practicality. We've also told you that this is going to lead to neocolonialism in the second substantive point, if we allow developed nations to perpetually fund renewable energy sources in developing countries, which was an argument that they only came back to in the opposition reply. And we say that to the comments made in the opposition reply that we can make renewable energy cheaper. Well, what kind of development project takes money from a beggar, ladies and gentlemen? We say developing countries in the status quo simply cannot pay for the measures that have been suggested by side opposition, and their model simply does not stand. Now, our example of China is a very good example of how this can work. In the beginning stages, before they were developed, before they can pay for it, they had accidents, like the Three Gorges Dam. But after they started to gain the capabilities, they now have renewable energy sources, such as nuclear power plants, solar panels. And all of these things can happen if we give developing nations time, ladies and gentlemen. Let's deal with the principle. They never once dealt with our argument that people suffer in the developing world as a result of economic maladies, except to say that they reject the false dichotomy. What kind of dichotomy are they rejecting, ladies and gentlemen? The dichotomy that we reject inside proposition today, ladies and gentlemen, that deaths should somehow be a consequence of environmental protection. They never told us why it's the developing world that needs to take action, when the developing world well contributes more than 50% of global emissions, and well over that in terms of other forms of environmental degradation. They bring us limited examples like China and India, which we've already told you is something that helps our case. They never essentially told us why it should be the developing countries that have to pay responsibility for the developed countries' mistakes. The opposition reply comes up here and says that they're going to hold the developed countries accountable and stop the developing countries take responsibility for their own pollution. But what we would say should be the developed countries that take responsibility for the totality of the damage that they have done to Mother Earth. We also tell you that developing countries simply cannot practically solve the problems that the developing countries created, and it is on this side of the house that the values of responsibility and practicality falls in this debate. I beg to propose. Thank you.